Thank you.
Glad to be here.
Please, you would like to be there or stand
I'm going to
here?
move around. They're not going to be able to keep track.
Are we going to be okay with
Yeah,
the...
I've got it all worked out.
Yeah.
I know all the details.
Perfect.
Okay,
But then I'm going to
thank
let you go ahead and just remind everybody, Congresswoman Katie Porter will show up eventually. When she does show up, we will wait, of course, for Dr. Huestis to be done, and then we'll have her give her a short intervention. I think she will speak about 15, 20 minutes on a topic of her choice. We really wanted to have the Congresswoman Porter here because she's a UCI faculty, and she really cares about the issue of cannabis and legalization of cannabis. So we thought there was a really good opportunity to give her a possibility to share with us her thoughts. Now, it's all yours. I'm looking forward to your presentation, Marilyn.
Thank you. It's really lovely to be here. Daniele, I have such admiration for his research, and we're collaborating now on research, which is even better. I love to come to California. I've actually lived here 4 times, a military brat and a military wife, so moved around a lot. So this is a really important topic, and it's extremely timely. And I appreciate so many of law enforcement being here too. This is an issue for all of us to consider. And when I get to my conclusions, you'll see that really all of us as society have to make decisions, okay? And that's really what our laws are about, is what the public wants the laws to be, and then makes those decisions. So I'm going to talk about cannabis and driving, not a new alcohol and driving problem, but it is the #1 short-term consequences of cannabis legalization. So I have a whole talk where I talk about the short-term consequences and the long-term consequences of cannabis exposure, but we're going to stick today, and maybe at the panel we can try some of the other topics. Okay, so they told me this works. There we go. Okay, so there's a big difference between alcohol and cannabis. So when you're dealing with alcohol, it's one compound, ethanol. They take it orally. You can't titrate your dose. Obviously you can titrate how many drinks you take, but once it's in your system, it's going to act. It's entirely water soluble, zero order pharmacokinetics, which means you excrete the same amount of alcohol every hour. You definitely don't tend to think you're impaired. You think you're perfectly fine, and that's one of the problems, because people still go out and drive after they're very drunk. There's a very clear relationship between the concentration and the effect, okay? It's a linear line, and cannabis is just so much more complex. There are more than 500 different cannabinoids present in the cannabis plant, and the number of cannabinoids keeps changing. So when I was in Israel in January, there's a person there who actually says they've identified 144 cannabinoids. Most of us think 109, 110, 20. So more and more is coming out. And we're learning so much about the plant and the cannabinoids and the good things about it and the bad things about it. So inhalation is the primary way people take cannabis in. And I say inhalation now instead of smoking because a lot of people smoke it, but a lot of people use vaporizers now. That is a device. It was originally devised so that people who were taking it medically could use the vaporizer, but I have found out even on my street at home that I was all excited about the new vaporizer and they knew all about it. I was the last one to know. So it heats the cannabis at a lower temperature. So a lot of the polyaromatic hydrocarbons and other cancerous compounds will not volatilize. It goes into a bag and then you can breathe it in. So you can still titrate that way as well. THC, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, is the primary psychoactive compound in cannabis. And THC is highly lipophilic, so completely opposite than ethanol that distributes throughout your body water. In the blood, actually in your blood, THC would not dissolve. You have to carry it around the body with specific proteins. because of its inability to dissolve in water-like substances. It has a multi-compartment pharmacokinetic profile. So you will see, we'll look at some examples, but it is not simple like alcohol at all. And it loves to be stored in the fat, any fatty tissue, and also the organs that are highly perfused. So the organs like the brain, the heart, the lungs, all of those that get a lot, kidney, that get a lot of blood flow, you'll find THC in there initially, and then it's going to redistribute into fat. So very rapidly excreted initially, and people have to know that. It goes in really quick, and it comes out really quick. But once it gets down to a certain level, in chronic frequent users, it can stay there for a long period of time, and I'll show you that. One thing about cannabis users is that many times they actually think they might be impaired, and they may try to compensate for that impairment by driving slower or keeping bigger distances in front of you, and I'll show you some examples. But what's so interesting about that, the number one reason that cannabis users are picked up is for speeding. So the kinds of doses that we can do in human research may not be the doses that people are taking on themselves on the road. Hi, Jennifer, I was looking for you. Okay, and then, so it's a very complex concentration effect curve that we have. Now, I want to tell you, I'm very excited. My new academic position is at the Institute for Emerging Health Professions, and it's the Lambert Center for the Study of Medicinal Cannabis and Hemp. So I am a big believer that there are components within cannabis that offer new therapeutic approaches. So I really believe that, but I think we need the science behind it to prove when it's efficacious or not. So we're not going to talk a lot about that today. This is an excellent resource for anyone. Daniele was part of this group. They had excellent researchers look at everything that had been published on medicinal cannabis. And they went through those data and they decided that there was enough evidence to say this worked. We didn't have enough evidence, or we have enough evidence that it doesn't work. And there were very few medical indications where we have enough data to say that it's actually efficacious. So what's unfortunate, I think, about what's going in our country now is everybody thinks cannabidiol can solve everything. Everything from aches and pains and cuts and infection and whatever, and we just don't have that information. So I think the public is terribly misinformed about the actual proven scientific medical evidence that different cannabinoids are therapeutic. And we have a beautiful new example. In June last year, the FDA approved the first cannabis plant. The Epidiolex is the almost pure CBD, but it did start out as an extract from the plant, and it went through all the things that you need to do to get a drug approved, and it's for children with Dravet syndrome and Lennox-Gastaut, the multiple seizures. So this is Charlotte, and this was the issue that really got medical cannabis moving. So now we have a lot of potential, but we need to do the scientific studies to show whether it's effective or not for different indications. Now, cannabis is so important because we have a critical system in our brains that everybody has called the endogenous cannabinoid system. And this is a highly conserved system back over thousands of years. And it's a critically important system, and people don't understand this. So we did not develop this system so we could enjoy using cannabis, okay? This system has critical functions. So let's look at some of them. The reason, look, isn't that cool? All right, so the amygdala, there we go, the amygdala. The amygdala is the center of emotion, anxiety, fear. When people use cannabis, the amygdala lights up and they feel euphoria and relaxation. And this is one of the reasons people like to use cannabis. All right, look here at the brainstem. Okay, the brainstem. And the brainstem is very much important for vomiting and pain sensation. And there are some receptors, cannabinoid receptors in that area. But we don't ever have anybody die from cannabis. I used to say that all the time. I still say it for the plant material. Now, yes, they could have a psychotic episode and jump off a bridge, or they could be driving and they could kill themselves and someone else. But cannabis is not going to stop you from breathing. It's not going to stop your heart from beating. What's interesting, very few receptors there, and they're very concentrated in certain areas. Not like our opioid epidemic that we're in the middle of, where we have so many opioid receptors there, and the opioid receptors then will stop you from breathing and stop your heart from beating. So the other really important areas, the hypothalamus, where's my circle? This is fun. This is like a thing. All right, you'll just have to look. So the hypothalamus is critically important. It's part of the center old brain, we might call it, involved in appetite, hormones, sexual behavior. The endogenous cannabinoid system is so tied into survival. So yes, it's involved with hormones, the reproduction hormones. It's involved with eating, appetite, right? Everybody hears the marijuana munchies. And all my studies where we dose, so I was at the National Institute on Drug Abuse for almost 25 years and was very fortunate to be able to do human-controlled administration studies. And that's how we learned. We did brain imaging, we did psychomotor studies, we did cognitive studies, we did a lot with the different biological samples to understand what is going on. So the hypothalamus has a lot of CB1 cannabinoid receptors, again, involved in these important areas of survival. If we look at the hippocampus, memory and learning, one of the most acute effects of cannabis is loss of short-term memory, okay? And that's really tough. When you have kids in school and learning is their #1 job while they're at that age, and if they're using a lot of cannabis, they're not remembering a lot of the things that they're learning. If you look at the cerebellum and the basal ganglia, those are two areas of the brain critically important for motor control, motor planning, initiation of movement, loaded with cannabinoid receptors, and that's where we have the problem with motor control when individuals use cannabis. And I think the big area I want you to see, we'll try it one more time. Hey guys, Mr. Techies. Oh, I gotta really move. Here is the neocortex, the cortex of the brain. And this is one of the big differences between us and animals, is that we've developed this huge cortex. And the reason we developed it is for executive control. And executive control is taking in all the information from your environment. You have to first decide it's important or not. Is it salient? Because we don't realize we take in a lot more information than we ever pay attention to consciously. So the brain says, nope, that's not important, that's not important. And then second of all, once you say it's important and look at it, you compare it to your memory, what your knowledge is, what does this mean? You decide on a course of action, and then you have to implement it. And cannabis slows every one of those processes. So part of the issue is with cannabis is effects on executive function. Really has a huge difference. Okay, and here's just listing some of these important issues. And if you think about driving, driving is a complex task. You have to know what's going on in your environment. You have to know what the pavement is like. Is it wet? Could there be ice on it? Not here in Irvine, but in most of other places. You have to think about street lights. You have to think about people coming out. of side street? Is a truck going to pass you? It's really complex behavior. And cannabis will affect all of these. Am I going backwards or forward? Yeah. There we go. So if it's a neurotransmitter system, there have to be endogenous cannabinoids, right? Or neurotransmitters. So we found the cannabinoid receptors in the brain. These are some, and there are many, different neurotransmitters that work with the cannabinoid system, as well as other receptors as well. So this was a big, exciting thing when, first of all, the receptors were found, and then we figured out how you communicate. Now, if you're a chemist, you know those don't look like other neurotransmitters. They're actually fatty acid derivatives. So not only does cannabis like fatty material, but the neurotransmitters are actually derivatives of material. And these are just two of the ones that are very important. So let's talk about smoking cannabis and increased motor vehicle injuries and deaths. Okay, we were really lucky because in the United States we have the world's most advanced driving simulator. It was built by National Highway Safety Administration, NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. And it was also money from the Office of National Drug Control Policy. It's at the University of Iowa, and it's a wonderful resource. This is where all the datas were done to find out how dangerous it is to text when you drive and how it can really affect your concentration and ability to function. And I had complained for 10 years to NHTSA and ONDCP, you have never tested an illicit drug. So the people who use it are the pharmaceutical companies testing out new drugs. NHTSA has used it as well. But in fact, they hadn't tested alcohol till a year before I got to test cannabis. So we were very lucky. After 10 years, they finally said, here's your money, shut up and run the study. And I was happy to do that. So the only way this study was possible was money from the Office of National Drug Control Policy. NHTSA chipped in some, and obviously the National Institute on Drug Abuse did as well. And it's a phenomenal opportunity to show the effects of not only cannabis, we were very interested in cannabis, but cannabis and low-dose alcohol, because that's the common combination that people use. They'll have a couple of beers and then a couple of joints. So we really wanted to look at that combination. It's an amazing facility. It's in the size of an aircraft hangar. And look underneath, I don't know if I can do this, yeah. Okay, this area has all kinds of actuators that give you all the sense of it being real. I've driven the car, there's a full car inside that orb, and it can run on these tracks really fast. So you feel acceleration, you feel when you put your foot on it, the braking, and we had to write a script that described a 45-minute drive. So we wanted to test a lot. It cost $1,500 a half hour to be in this because it requires a large number of engineers to be running everything. And we had 7 different sessions of 45 minutes each. And this is funny too, because I told the people, our co-investigators at the University of Iowa, we're gonna have to start with a lot of people to get 20 completers in the study. And they said, this is Iowa. Iowa people always show up. And I said, well, you haven't worked with the drug use population, have you? And they said, oh, no. So I said, you're putting in this bid, I'm telling you, you better raise the number. It took us 111 people to get 20 through the whole study, 111 people. So anyhow, this device, we designed a study to be sensitive to the effects of cannabis. Okay, that's very important. And what does cannabis affect? All that divided attention thing, the ability to pay attention to things going on in your environment. And so we had a drive, which I'll show you in a minute. Yeah, so there's the car inside, and you have to write a script 360 degrees so that they see the car coming towards you, they look over, they see the person in the car, you see the taillights, and so it's very sophisticated to get that driven. And I wanted to put all those things in it that would be affected by cannabis. So here you can see, that's me actually, and you see we have cameras on the eyes, so we can even tell how people are searching, you know, what's going on in my environment and checking things out. So it was very sophisticated. Should I be going this way, guys? Okay, so we made up this drive, and we had, like you worked in the city, it was nighttime, you're leaving work, and you go out, and then you get onto a freeway, and then eventually you have a long rural drive home to your house. So the reason this is important is in the city, there's lights, there's people opening cars' doors, there's traffic lights, there's a lot going on in city driving. Then you get onto the freeway and you have all the challenges of trucks and are you gonna pass and people coming up behind you. So we have a highway section with a lot of challenges, and then we have that long rural drive back. And that's because one of the things that cannabis affects a lot is that autonomous driving that we all do. You know, we know the way home from work, we just get in the car, we drive, we may be thinking about a million other things, and you don't even realize that you're driving and going there. So cannabis affects that as well. So here's the study. They drink a glass of juice, and it may have alcohol in it, it may not. And we try to keep this really double-blind placebo. So even on the placebo dose, we put just a little alcohol on the top, so it sort of smells like alcohol, has a little taste. They have 10 minutes to drink that. We wanted to get them to a 0.065 so that when they got into the car, which is not for 30 minutes or 25 minutes, is that that's the peak impairment. It's not immediate. The peak impairment is about 30 minutes after they start to smoke cannabis, okay? So we timed everything that we would hit that period, and we gave enough alcohol that they should have about a 0.05 the entire time they're driving. So another thing, I'm sure most of you know this, in the US, except for Utah now, we have a 0.08, okay, as our per se limit. You know, most of the world, it's 0.05, and in Scandinavia, it's 0.02. And I do a lot of research with colleagues in Scandinavia, and everybody drives their car to the restaurant, we all drink wine, nobody even thinks about driving home. You all take cabs home and you go pick up your car the next day. And it's a culture that is just built on that. Okay, so after they drink the alcohol, then they have 10 minutes to do ad lib smoking of the cannabis. This is so important. When I started out as a researcher, everybody did paced smoking, okay, where you control, obviously, the potency, you control the number of puffs, you control the length of inhalation, you control the hold time in the lungs, and you control the exhalation. And I did my first study that way. And then I started thinking and looking around and that this is not how people smoke cannabis at all. And so we have used ad lib smoking, and when you look at cannabis literature, read the details. First of all, what do they define as their user group? In Scandinavia, they write papers and they say that a heavy cannabis user smokes once a week. Okay, that's a very different definition of what we have. So in all my studies, an occasional cannabis user is someone who smokes less than daily. Okay, that could be a lot of cannabis use, right? And the chronic frequent, so don't use the word heavy. What does heavy mean? Are they overweight? Is they, you know, it doesn't mean anything. So we use chronic frequent to describe the individuals who smoke on a basically daily basis, and some of them are amazing. I've had people self-report using 60 joints or blunts a day. Does everybody know what a blunt is? Okay, so a blunt is a cigar that's hollowed out and then packed with cannabis. In Baltimore, they don't mess around with joints, it's all blunts, okay? But it's interesting about the blunt because they don't sit down and just smoke the whole blunt. If they're by themselves, they'll just take 1 or 2 puffs, put it out, and come back to it. But a lot of times they're in a group and then they pass the blunt around. Okay, so they have 10 minutes to smoke any way they want. Then they have a 45-minute drive, and we have kids coming out on bicycles. We have people opening the door. When you get to the rural thing, I have deer coming out of the woods, because you hear so much cannabis smokers say, I'm a better driver, I can drive. And if you look at any of the surveys, people will say, oh, I can drive, I always drive. They've done surveys of young people. They live within an hour after smoking cannabis. And this is a huge problem, because cannabis users might be able to get home 9 out of 10 times. But the 10th time, something unexpected happens. And I'll tell you this story. This is my sad, sad story, but it's absolutely true. So this young person's driving down the road, got 2 or 3 friends in the car, and he's in the little town, and he looks way down the road, and there's an old man crossing the road. And like all of us do, subconsciously we go, oh, no problem, he's moving, I'm gonna be there after him. But the old man drops his keys, and he's not very flexible, and he can't get them, and he's down, he's trying to pull. First of all, the kid sees it just a little bit later. He has to think about it. He has to go to his memory. He has to decide, what am I going to do? Is he still going to be gone when I'm there? Do I slam on my brakes? I go, and he runs him over. This is a true story. He didn't have any intention of driving him over. So the big thing with the cannabis driver is anything unexpected. Somebody slams on the brake in front of you. A kid comes out on a bicycle. In New England, you hit a piece of ice. That's the big problem, is unexpected events. Okay, so they drive, and then they wanted us very much to take these individuals back to the clinical research area and have the study be over. And I said, we need blood. We're gonna keep them here. We're gonna keep drawing blood, because we need to compare what happens during driving with the concentrations and how they change. This is just all the different things that we built into the study to do it. It cost $100,000 just to write the script for people driving under the effects of cannabis. But it's there now, people. If you want to use it, you could do it. All right, so I'm going to summarize very quickly and get into other things, the results of this study. Very surprisingly, we have breath alcohol on the y-axis, time after dose on the x-axis. We didn't expect this. If cannabis is on board with alcohol, you significantly delay the peak of alcohol. And when we really thought about this, it made really good sense, because guess what? Cannabis slows gastric emptying. It slows the time for your stomach to dump into the intestines. Most of the alcohol is absorbed in the intestine, not in the stomach. So if cannabis slows that dumping into the intestine, this is why, could be the reason why we found a significant later time. The big one is that we found when alcohol's on board, you can have a higher peak THC concentration. So that's a very important interaction as well, is if they've drunk the alcohol, they could get more THC, and we think that's because alcohol causes the blood vessels and the tiny capillaries to relax and open, and perhaps in the lung, maybe that's why they're able to get a better bioavailability, a better delivery of the THC from the lung. Okay, so this is our lateral control. So lateral control is in your lane. How much do you wiggle and move and weave in your lane? And unfortunately, cross the line to the left and hit people head on, or go off to the right and run into a tree or some other object. And a lot of cannabis cases involve that crossing the lane and hitting people head on. So a big problem. So we want to measure that lateral control. Okay, thank you. All right, but I also want to say, because people always say this, it drives me nuts. Don't bring this up later. Isn't cannabis less harmful than alcohol? And the answer is yes, it is less harmful. Here's an example. We showed significant lane weaving with cannabis, but alcohol also affected departures out of the lane, actually going completely out of the lane, and alcohol also had more rapid movement of the weaving within the lane. So if you're thinking about public health and safety, alcohol is a huge problem. We've made great improvements since the 1970s. And yes, it can have odds ratio, which is what they talk about with harm. It can have odds ratios way up there when somebody's at 0.15, 0.2, whatever. But if cannabis doubles the risk of being involved in a serious injury, we don't want that, okay? It may not have as high ratios as alcohol has, but you don't want to double your risk. And I have parents, you talk about public misconceptions. I have parents say to me, oh, I'm so proud because Jimmy's not drinking and driving. He's only smoking pot and driving. And I can't believe it that parents don't understand, much less the young people. And when you talk with young people, they say, how can cannabis be bad? It's medicine. How can cannabis be bad? It's legal. They need to, I am so strong about, I want an educated public to make the decisions, right? If you know it. If you're a parent and you know that cannabis is really going to affect the development of neurons in your child's brain, I mean, those are the things that are happening. And I myself have done so much in utero drug exposure research and many others, and we have it all published about the effects of cannabis on the developing brain. And yet there are obstetricians in Colorado that are recommending marijuana to their pregnant patients for nausea and vomiting, when we know the endogenous cannabinoid system is critical for the developing brain. So we've got problems with in utero drug exposure, we've got problems with breastfeeding, and using cannabis. We've got all the teenagers, and now they're starting as early as 11 and 12 when their brains are just forming. And these are changes that are going to be permanent. You don't change the structure of your brain. Okay, so that's the alcohol discussion. Okay, so what we were able to do in this study, because we had for each individual how they performed on alcohol and how they performed on cannabis and how they performed when they had both on board, for the first time we were able to come up with numbers. The impairment at a 0.05 BAC, breath alcohol, was the same as an 8.2 nanogram per mil THC. And a 0.08, someone with 13.1 nanograms of THC had the same impairment as an alcohol at 0.08. And when we let these data out, and there was a big public release on it, I said over and over and over, these are the concentrations at the time of driving, okay? At the time of driving. And unfortunately, people have really misused that. And so, can I get another clicker that works? Okay, so one of the things, remember how I said how we decreased the, we increased the time so we could take blood samples, and these data are really important. Next, please. All right, so this is Rebecca Hartman, one of my graduate students, And what we showed is that the THC concentration in blood, about 74% of it is gone out of the blood in the first 30 minutes. And after 1.4 hours, 90% of it is out of the blood. So you can imagine how rapidly this is dropping. In the United States, the average time to draw blood after a crash or after a police stop is 1.4 to 4 hours. 1.4 to 4 hours. And 90% of it is out of the blood in 30 minutes. Sorry, 1.4 hours. Thanks so much. Okay, so if you don't get that blood quickly, it could go below whatever limit that you have. And now we have to have warrants in many states to get a blood draw as well. So also, you can't back extrapolate. I'm very happy. I have never seen a toxicologist who tries to back extrapolate a THC concentration because you can't. It's too complex. All right, so let's look at longitudinal control. The longitudinal control is moving within your lane forward and backward. So your speed is part of the issue, your variability in speed, and also the distance that you're keeping to the car in front of you. So let's look. We have THC alone, and when you have THC alone, in the doses that we were able to give individuals, there was a decreased speed, there was an increase in the amount of time they were below the speed limit by 10%, and they increased their following distance. And then if you look at alcohol, alcohol increases the variability of speed and increases the percent of time that they are above the speed limit. And if you look at the combination, we actually had a significant effect. Okay. Thank you. I'm afraid. Can you just advance it? There you go. Go, keep going. Keep going. Next one. Okay. So if you look here, as the THC concentration increases, you have more reduction in speed. But here's something very important at looking at this data. You're all looking from low to high. Remember that the peak concentration occurs while they're smoking. While they're smoking, people titrate their dose, they see how their heart is beating, they feel the effects, and it's all called smoking topography, how they smoke. And so there's huge differences in how people smoke cannabis, which is why I stopped doing paste cannabis. So what happens is it peaks at the very point just before the end of smoking. And so you should be looking at these data from the high concentrations down, because the whole time that they're going to be driving, it's going to be dropping like a rock, right? We saw 74% and 90%. So in reality, yes, they might be driving slower right at the peak, but then as it's dropping off so quickly, it has very little effect. And here is showing the following distance. And the following distance is the same thing. It may look like there's a pretty big following distance, but it's dropping so quickly, it's becoming less of an effect. And here we look at the alcohol. The alcohol, as it increases during absorption, which is much slower, you see that you will have increases in speed. And if you look at them together, at the bottom here, think about the cannabis effects going down, and you can see that the effect that it has on slowing very rapidly is overcome by the effects of the alcohol, which is more speeding. And I wanted to show you this because this comes from the International Association of Chiefs of Police, Chuck Hayes, and we did a research project that was wonderful that I maybe next year will tell you about. It was very interesting data from all over the US, but here the number one reason cannabis individuals are stopped by traffic is due to speed. Okay, so let's see the absorption. Now this is from the PACE data, And if you look here, you will see, can't see, each one of the arrows is a single puff. And you can see the THC, that's the blue. That is how rapidly, look, that's in terms of minutes, how rapidly it increases. You smoke, it goes into the lungs, it goes to the left side of the heart and straight to the brain. A very rapid route of administration, very similar to what we have with intravenous administration. So it goes very, very high. Now look how it starts to level off. That's when the person, their heart is beating out of their chest, they're having all of their effects, and they're like, okay, I'm good here. And the way in which they smoke changes. They don't inhale it and hold it deeper in the lungs. The one thing I couldn't control was the depth of inhalation. I controlled everything else, and yet there was a huge ability to titrate their dose. It always occurs before the peak, and then the distribution, when after the last puff on the cannabis cigarette, the distribution is very rapid too, because this THC is being carried around in the blood by proteins, and as it goes through the tissues, it's just pulled off into the tissues because it's lipid soluble, likes that much better. The brain is a very lipophilic organ. All of the myelin around the neurons are lipid-like, so the THC gets rapidly into the brain. And you can see that there's also metabolism going on at that point and some elimination as well. Okay, so then we wanted to study the difference between occasional cannabis users and chronic frequent cannabis users. I like to think that I divide my career in half at NIDA, and the first half we spent all our time on acute cannabis exposure, and it took me that long to figure out how am I going to study the chronic frequent cannabis smoker, because for ethical reasons and safety reasons, we would never give people as much drug as they give themselves and for as long. So I finally figured out, okay, the way to do this is just bring them in at night. We brought them in at 9 or 10 at night because I did not want them acutely impaired in the morning, but I didn't want them in cannabis withdrawal either, right? Cannabis withdrawal is a real syndrome. It is not life-threatening like alcohol, but people are miserable. They're irritable, they can't sleep, they get into arguments with people. It's really a problem. So here we have our occasional users. I want you to notice a couple of things. It's a logarithmic scale on the y-axis, okay? So big, big changes. Look what happens in the occasional users. They come in with no THC. It shoots right up during the inhalation, and the peak occurs during the process of smoking, and then it slowly drops off. The line, dotted line, is our limit of quantification. And you'll see that vaporization is very similar to smoking. How about edibles? So the edibles is the purple. Well, you take an edible and it takes time. It's got to get into the stomach. Some's degraded there because of the low pH of the stomach. And then it gets picked up by the portal circulation and goes right to the liver. And what happens in the liver? It starts metabolizing it very quickly. So very characteristic here. Look how long it took to actually peak. This was in a cannabis brownie. I actually had the NIDA pharmacy make brownies. That was a new job for them. And you see that the peak is going to occur much later and much lower. This is the same amount, 50.6 milligrams, that they inhaled or smoked or had in a brownie. So it's much later. And this is why you hear about all the emergency department visits due to edibles. And if you've gone to Colorado, you can get anything you want. If they make soda or gummy bears or lollipops, you can get it with cannabis in it now. And so people will take that cookie, and only if they look at the bottom of the cookie in the fine print where it says this is 100 milligrams, break this little cookie into 10 pieces. I don't share my cookies with anybody. I mean, 10 pieces out of a cookie. So they eat the whole cookie and they don't realize it. Guess what? Nothing happens. So they eat the second cookie. And then a couple hours later, boom. And we don't know why, we scientists don't know why, but there's a lot more psychosis with edibles than we see with smoked cannabis. And we don't know that answer. Now, another big difference is the 11-hydroxy-THC. Look at the relationship between the 11-hydroxy. The 11-hydroxy is the first metabolite. It is equal potent. It's just as strong as THC. After smoking, the 11-hydroxy is much less, and people tend to not pay attention to it. I'm very happy now that most toxicology labs are doing THC, 11-hydroxy, and carboxy. Because when you're talking about edibles, you can have more 11-hydroxy than you do THC. So they're both equal potent, both important. But this is what an occasional user looks like. And here's the carboxy THC. This is the most common metabolite. It is not psychoactive, okay? So when you get to this point, it's not affecting the body, the carboxy THC. And again, a thing we don't know, why do we get more carboxy after the edibles than we do after the others? Now here's our chronic frequent cannabis smokers. Look at the concentration when they come in, okay? So some of them are smoking right outside the door before they come in, but in fact, almost all of them smoked the day they came in. So they come in and look at the concentrations they have just when they come in. I keep them, we have a closed research unit. Nobody can come in, no visitors. They're checked to make sure they're not bringing any drugs in. And boy, have they tried to bring drugs in. I was naive. A guy said, oh, I gotta have my guitar. Please let me have my guitar. Sure, why not? And it was packed full of cannabis. Another person had MPT or whatever it is, little player. He had managed to get some in there. So we learned the tricks. Look at the concentrations, right? When they're smoking really high. Again, the much lower peak after oral. Okay, here's the 11-hydroxy in this population. And look at the carboxyglucuronide. It's amazing. So this is in their blood when they start, and it hardly changes. You can hardly see a bump where we dose them, right? Well, this is the inactive compound, but what you have to know is if you're an occasional user, you take the drug in, it goes to your brain, it goes to all your organs, it goes into your fat, and then it's leached out very, very slowly, even below what we can measure. And so you have more time to let the drug out than the drug that's coming in. But if you're a chronic frequent cannabis smoker, you're bringing in more drug than your body can excrete out. So you start to build up this, we call it body burden of THC. It is the parent THC that is stored in the body. And there's a wonderful paper by Patrick Mura out of France, and I know him, and he did a study of motor vehicle fatalities in France, and he showed that you can still find THC in the brain when it's not measurable in blood, okay? So the THC gets into the brain, and it's the active compound that is stored. Okay, so this was what upset all of the toxicologists in the United States and a lot of policymakers. We all thought that THC was out of your blood in 6 to 8 hours. Every bit of scientific evidence showed that. Look at my chronic cannabis users, okay? It's the middle line here. I couldn't believe it. They have no access to drugs. I actually sent 2 cannabis users home at the end of 30 days, and they still had 0.3 nanograms per mil of THC. Low levels, but it can be detected for a very long time. And it's because of that body burden of drug that they have that keeps leaching out. So as soon as that happened, we said, oh boy, we're in trouble now, because what are we going to do about cannabis impaired driving? How are we going to handle the fact that it can be around for such a long time after somebody last used? So we started looking for other markers that might indicate recent cannabis use. So we developed a method and we added in tetrahydrocannabivarin, one of the other 120 cannabinoids, cannabidiol, cannabigerol, cannabinol, and we then started measuring these in blood. And what we found out is the metabolite of tetrahydrocannabivarin is around just as long as THC metabolite, and THCV and THC glucuronide, if you find them, it's very, very recent use, but you don't find them very often. The three that we were able to find after a very short period of time after use was cannabidiol, cannabigerol, and cannabinol. If someone uses it orally, so any kind of edible, you'll never see these because even the THC is low concentration, so you're not going to see these other minor cannabinoids. Also, so if you find them, it means recent use. If you don't find them, you cannot rule out recent use. And you can't use cannabidiol at all because there's too many cannabidiol oils and other things that are out now products. So CBG and CBN are markers of recent use. Now, this was, I think, one of the most exciting things, and Daniele was saying about your career. This, to me, was amazing. At the National Institute of Mental Health, they developed a new brain PET imaging ligand, okay? And this, they were hoping it was going to be for a different receptor. I was lucky it was for the CB1 cannabinoid receptor. So we collaborated on this study. We brought in a lot of chronic cannabis individuals. They stayed on our unit. The next day we took them down to NIH and we scanned their brains for the density of CB1 cannabinoid receptors. Here we had 26 healthy subjects and 28 cannabis smokers. Notice the cannabis smokers had been smoking on average 12 years and they average smoked 10 joints or blunts per day. And this is what we found. I really want you to take time to understand this. So the black bars are the controls. This is normal individuals that have used cannabis less than 10 times in their life. Wherever you see a blue bar, it was a significant decrease in the cannabinoid receptors in that part of the brain. So if you look at the bottom, ACC is anterior cingulate cortex, AMY, the amygdala, caudate, the hippocampus, insula, all different areas of the brain we were able to evaluate. And so look at all the stars in all these areas of the brain that are carrying out critically important functions. We showed an objective measure of chronic frequent cannabis use. Okay, that's important. And these individuals I showed you, we started with 30. This is, we only had 14 left after 28 days. They were going through withdrawal. They're very unhappy. And they're, they're volunteers. They can leave anytime they want. It's a medical experiment. And so a lot of them left. And I was really upset thinking, we aren't going to have enough power to show anything. And here we still, with the 14, were able to show after 28 to 30 days abstinence that the brain was able to adapt again. And the brain adapted and the density of the cannabinoid receptors went back to no difference with normals. So very important, it showed that the brain can adapt to the constant stimulation of cannabis. And we didn't prove this, but we all think, like other receptors, that they actually internalize them into the nerves and break them down, and they're no longer available to do it. This is tolerance, okay? And you hear people all the time say, well, they smoke all the time, they're tolerant to the effects. Very important, tolerance is never complete, and I'm going to show you some data on that. All right, so think about this. If we know from other work, including mine, Harrison Pope and I at Harvard showed in chronic frequent cannabis smokers, they were impaired at baseline compared to the others. They were cognitively, by 30 days in our study, they had returned to normal. Karen Bola's study, 30 days later, they still show impairment, but they showed improvement all along the way. So maybe it was going to be 35 days or 40 days, but they were improving with abstinence. A very good friend of mine, Nadia Solowij, yeah, that's the gymnast, right? Nadia Solowij from Australia, she and I really appreciate each other's work, but we sort of had a disagreement because my work said you could return to normal with abstinence. She has chronic cannabis users who 10 years after last use still have slower nerve transmission. Okay, remember I said everything's slowed? There's still, the impulses are delayed. So what we did is Jan Ramakers at the University of Maastricht. I'm extremely jealous of this man. We're good friends. You know, he can do lab studies like I do. He can do driving simulators. He actually has them smoke cannabis and puts them out on the regular roads with you and me. He has a specially designed car with a person in there who, for safety purposes, is there to do it. So he had shown that he has 2 tasks where if they did poorly in the lab, it predicted they would do poorly on the road. So we brought a graduate student over for a year, we brought all his equipment over, and we had included it in this study. And here are the amazing results. The control, this is tracking error, okay, in chronic frequent smokers. The controls are light cannabis users, light drug users. At baseline, they're impaired. Day 8, they're impaired. 2 weeks later, they're impaired. And 3 weeks after last use, they're still impaired. Why? They still have that THC in the brain. It's the active drug in the brain that's still there. So we looked at other factors. The second one, divided attention task control losses. They improve. From baseline, they improve, but they're still significantly impaired compared to controls 3 weeks later. Okay, so what about tolerance? This is a beautiful study by D'Souza out of Yale. The open circles are the chronic frequent users. The closed circle are the rare users of cannabis. At baseline, when nobody's acutely impaired, the individuals who don't use the drug are going to do, did I say them backwards? Yeah. The open circles are the non-users and the closed circles are the chronic frequent users. So notice that at baseline, the people who don't use cannabis will perform better in memory tasks. But you give them cannabis and the people who don't use it are going to drop, their performance drops tremendously. The performance of the chronic frequent cannabis user also drops, but not as steeply. Okay, that's an example for you of tolerance. And here's another example from my own work. So these are hysteresis, not the ones that Daniele was talking about, but these are hysteresis curves in occasional users and frequent users. So you need to understand this. Look on the y-axis, the effect we're looking at is how high do you feel right now? And look at the occasional users. It goes up very, very quickly and then it slowly drops. Look how high they are at only 10 nanograms per mil, which is the same as micrograms per liter. Look what the chronic frequent user has to do to get even close to that high. He's got to take in a lot more drug, and he doesn't even get all the way up to where the occasional users are. Beautiful example of tolerance, okay? So yes, some tolerance develops, but the individual will try to take in more drug to overcome that tolerance. Okay, so it takes a lot more drug to do it. So 2 good examples of tolerance. Okay, so we say, wow, this is complicated. Can we find a blood concentration that always indicates driving impairment? Canada had me come there 3 times before they legalized cannabis. And we talked about all the issues besides driving, and they just kept saying, give us a number, any number, what is the right number? And I kept saying, there is no right number. There's nothing you're ever gonna do to get a right number, and this is why. All right, so this is the percent of samples that are positive after they use cannabis. So let's look at the chronic frequent first. They're gonna be positive, 100% of them are positive at our limit of quantification, which is 1 microgram or 1 nanogram per mil, okay? So the chronic guys are gonna be positive for a full day, and then it's gonna drop off. Look at your occasional smokers. They go zoom, they're all positive for a very short period of time. By 7 hours, none of them are positive, okay? 2 populations you're dealing with. So let's look at the 5. So 5 nanograms per mil is what Washington State is using. Colorado has a different animal, law of inference. We won't talk about that. Look what happens with 5. First, you look at the chronic frequent user. Yep, they come in, and there's 70% of them are positive from all that drug they have stored. Over 19 hours before I dose them, it drops. It doesn't get to 0, but see how quickly it's still dropping. It shoots up, and 100% of them are positive for a short period of time. And then look how quickly it drops down, very quickly. And by about 5.5 hours, everybody else is gonna go to 0, but 16% of them have so much THC in their body, it just stays positive, 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 okay, for a long period of time. Now let's look at your occasional user. Now they're in gray. Okay, they come in negative, it shoots up. The first sample was 30 minutes after the start of cannabis smoking. Only 80% of them are positive at 5 within 30 minutes. And by 2.5 hours, nobody's positive as an occasional user. And they are high as a kite and they are impaired. So the problem is what we want to do is match the window of detection with the window of impairment, right? And if you could do that, you'd have a really good per se limit. And we can't do it. What number are you going to pick that's going to work with the frequent chronic cannabis users and the occasional users? There isn't a number that will do that. All right, cannabis and alcohol affect driving differently. On the left side, we have cannabis trying to compensate. They can perform simple tests. This is something really important I forgot I wanted to tell you. So I couldn't understand it. For years of working with different drug users, my cannabis users, when they were high as a kite, if you gave them something easy to do, arithmetic, whatever, they could do great, high or sober. And we didn't know why until some other people did brain imaging. And they showed that while you're doing, if you're sober and you have this little task to do, you use a small part of your brain. But if you're high, you can do the task, but you have to use so much of your brain to be able to do it. Now do you see how that works with divided attention? Your brain is already very, very, very busy with just being high and the effects of cannabis. And the amount of brain power you have to devote to other things is not as great. So it's a real problem. You can see what alcohol does, and then what they both do is in the middle. You have control losses, you have an inability to process changes, divided attention is a huge issue, concentration, tracking your position in the lane, and they have an increased reaction time. All right, so these are really challenging times. Cannabis is an illicit drug under federal law. California, 9 other states, and DC, it is illegal. I want to tell you, it was really hard not to back out from this meeting today, as Daniele knows, because today, the Federal Food and Drug Administration has an all-day meeting on cannabidiol. I'm dying to be there, okay? I'm doing a lot of cannabidiol research, but they're taping it, and hopefully it'll be available. But it's the public has their chance to say what they think about cannabidiol. And 420 people asked to speak, and there's no time, so I think 120 people from the public are going to be able to talk. It's illegal to drive when you're impaired by cannabinoids in all states. It is the primary drug other than alcohol. I used to say it's the primary illicit drug, but it's not illicit in some states anymore. In drug driving cases, motor vehicle crash injuries, and fatalities. Something I learned, we should never say accident. It's a crash. And I learned this from prosecutors of many cases where there were deaths. It's not an accident that somebody uses drugs and then decides to go out and drive. I am not a prude. Rob will tell you I like my champagne, okay? I really do. But you can smoke the cannabis, no problem. Don't give it to kids. Don't smoke in front of your babies. Don't go out and drive. Okay, they're very different risks for occasional and frequent smokers and experienced and inexperienced drivers. And we know that cannabis use is increasing in young people in states where it's legal. So we have this residual THC. We have partial tolerance with frequent intake. That's an issue. Recent cannabis exposure significantly increases crash risks from laboratory studies, on-the-road studies, and epidemiological studies. We can include more analytes that might help us interpret it, the results better, but that's expensive, and our labs don't have enough money now to do what they're being asked to do. Cannabinoid concentrations drop rapidly after smoking. Driving is a right, not a privilege. A per se criteria is very problematic because of the high risk and low concentrations in occasional users and residual THC in frequent users that we showed impairment for as long as the THC was in the brain. So what are our choices? An alternative is to require documentation of impairment first, and then you use a biological specimen to suggest what that drug is. The decisions on this issue are driven by society's priorities, and it's a balance between individual rights and public safety. So it's a big problem. So how best? I think we need to document psychomotor impairment. I would like to see the second specimen not be blood, but be oral fluid because of the way blood drops so quickly. And if all the test is doing is saying this person's impaired, and this is the drug that's present that could be causing the impairment, I think oral fluid's good. One thing that I think is pretty controversial, I think if you've proven the impairment, you take the oral fluid sample and it goes to the lab no matter what, because you've proven the impairment. And we all know there's 850 new drugs, novel psychoactive substances now, that the drug test, the little oral fluid test for maybe 6, 7 drugs. And don't forget that residual THC that also caused residual psychomotor impairment. Misconceptions, it must be safe if it's medicine, it must be safe if it's legal, it's not addictive, we know that's not true. That it doesn't affect cognitive or psychomotor performance. The tolerance is to all effects, that's not true. And cannabis use during pregnancy doesn't harm the fetus and the developing child. My wonderful people in my lab, and thanks so much.